Hello, it's Mark from Lightmap. I am using Cinema 4D with Corona Render. I'm going to use HDR Light Studio to light this front view of the watch. I've got HDR Light Studio started via the connection, and I've left the connection panel just floating so that we can bring it in and out as we need to use any of the controls on here. And then over here I've got the HDR Light Studio interface, and I've rearranged it to look like this. We've got our render view, canvas, light list is tabbed up with the light looks, and then I've got my light preview, light controls, light properties, and my presets are tabbed up with my light properties. So it's quite a nice, kind of taking up about half the screen with Light Studio. And then when I click inside of Cinema 4D, so that Light Studio doesn't go behind, I've turned on the always on top setting in HDR Light Studio. So that's the perfect way to use both of these together. So I'm going to turn on light paint so I can light paint in the viewport. So in the connection, I'm going to use reflection. So that tool is now on. So if we did want to do some light painting, I can do that over there. And then I'll just hide Light Studio, and we'll start Corona interactive rendering in the viewport. And the quality we can have at, say, or detail we can have at 75%. And I've set Corona in the render settings to leave a few cores spare for Light Studio. Otherwise it will kind of slow everything down a little bit. I think I found that in the preferences. If we go to the preferences panel, I think there's preferences for Corona. So it's come down, Corona at the bottom, and then I think I've got 16 threads. So interactive rendering -4 there. So it leaves 4 threads for Light Studio to use, and it keeps everything working nice and fast. So press start, got interactive rendering in the viewport. So that's perfect. So we can now open Light Studio again and start to think about how we're going to light this shot. So the kind of look that I want to go for is something like this kind of lighting, where it appears like you've got a very large panel and another panel kind of nearly touching each other, as seen from the front here. And then there's some nice subtleties of graduations of light where this edge is a bit brighter, this edge is a bit brighter, and then it falls away, then you've got a bit of brightness there. So this type of lighting is what I'm going to try and achieve in my lighting session. When I was doing a little bit of practice, just kind of thinking about how I'd approach this, I did actually say go onto my presets, get a softbox, let's scale that up and make it quite big. Let's click on the bottom, move the handle to the bottom of the light, and then click in the center of the watch face over here. Now this was the problem that I came up against. If I just get rid of the background there, hide the background, and we've got this softbox, you can see that yes, it's in front of the watch and it's reflecting here, it's illuminating, and it's kind of working. But as this face here, if I make another light and I click to the side here, and then if I duplicate that light and I click on the other side over here, you can see how wide this light would need to get to reach those extremities. So if I take my softbox and I make the width and just keep going with that width, kind of no matter how wide I make it, I can't get to those areas. So we're going to need to take a different approach. In a way, it's like the lighting needs to kind of wrap around. Now, a really good way to do this, if I delete those lights, is to actually do all of this lighting through the gradient background here. So let's open up the graph for the gradient background, And what we want to do is create this black area in the middle and then create these kind of bright areas coming off, and kind of just use this by adding points onto this gradient to get that kind of visual effect. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I'll double click to add a point, and this is going to be black. I'll double click again, make that black. I'm going to change the interpolation to bezier, and then get another point, and then I can drag that up. And then you can start to see here the kind of effect is starting to work, because it's wrapping around the entire sphere, and so the face and this part of the watch can see it. So this is quite an effective way of doing it. So let's create another point here, drag that not quite so high, and then take the end points down. So just adding points onto this ramp. And then ideally we want to control when that comes down there. To get more control using this ramp, there's a feature here called log. Now this ramp is linear, but then this is being shown when it's being mapped to RGB, sRGB effectively. Now to kind of compensate for this, if we put a log on this, it creates more contrast, and it's almost like inversely putting sRGB onto this ramp. The long and the short of it is, if you turn on log, the bright bits will stay the same brightness, but as it comes down, the dark bits get darker, so you can get this more contrast in your ramp. So it's like the LUT has now been applied so that you get more what you'd expect, basically. It's a little bit hard to explain. Effectively, whenever I use the ramp, I turn on log and I get what I expect in this view, much more like what I would expect. So let's turn up the brightness of this light now. And to avoid distractions, we'll just OK that, and we're going to put some background behind the watch that's just a flat white background. So I'm going to double click to add this light. It's added to the center of the canvas, which actually aligns with behind the watch, so that's worked out as a happy coincidence. And I'll scale that up a bit, and I'll actually just solo that just to be sure of the effect it's having, and that I'm not spilling light or reflections over the rest of the watch. So I'm not. So that looks good. So now when I adjust this gradient, I'm viewing it in a better context. Right, so let's carry on making some edits to this gradient. So, is the brightest part bright enough? I think not, so I'll just increase the brightness of this light to punch it up a bit. That's more like it, okay? And then everything's a bit soft. We want this kind of more hard edge, so I'm going to add another point to the ramp. Drag those down to there. And then we're going to try and make this steeper so that we get that quicker graduation from there to there. There we go, that's a bit harder there. And then we'll just fall off like that. So very much you just keep making changes and seeing how this affects the look over there. So this one wants to be bright, but not quite as bright, and we want to get that a little bit closer so that black gap isn't so large. Okay, so that's still could get closer, still could be a bit steeper. Might put double click, put an extra point in there. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that. The effect of having this gradient reflecting in the front of here, we get the lighting that we want, but it's quite bright on the watch face. It's kind of like we've washed out the face a little bit too much. So I'm going to make a soft round light, and I'm going to position that on this edge, which is basically at the front. I could click on here actually, and that uses the light paint to position it. And then we'll make the brightness 0. We'll make the blend mode over so that it's solid, and we'll scale this up a bit. Now, what we want to do is I want to block the reflection on this face a little bit. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the brightness 100, and I'm going to change the colour of this light to red, and I'm going to solo it so I can see the effect of this light only. It needs to be harder. Okay, so now this red light is reflecting in the front here. I can scale this down because we want it as small as possible, but we want it big enough to block the intense reflection that's coming from the background gradient. So okay, let's kind of leave it about that size. So if we turn the brightness of that down to 0, whatever colour it is, it'll be black. If we unsolo it, so what we've done there is if I turn that light off, you can see we've got quite a washed out face on the watch. If I turn it back on, we've just dimmed down that lighting. So we can then think about illuminating this face separately with some lighting in this area. We'll come back to that. So if we look at our reference image, particularly this one, you have this nice graduation coming away from that edge and that edge, and then you have a nice highlight at the bottom and the top. So we'll do that by making a soft light, and then we'll click on the top here, and then we can boost the brightness, and then we'll scale that up. So that looks nice. I might just take the brightness down a third of a stop, and then we'll duplicate that light, Control D, and we'll click on the bottom here, and maybe scale that one up a little bit. And you can adjust this on the canvas as well if you want to, just to kind of center them a little bit more. And now we've got those, I'm kind of looking at this background here and just thinking this could be boosted a little bit. So I'm just going to take the background gradient, give it a little boost. There we go. And now I'm thinking this edge here, I want to fall off a bit more subtly and not be so bright. So I'm going to edit that ramp. So I want that to be not as bright, and then to fall off more softly. There we go. Okay, so that's looking good to me. I want to see if there's any little spots where we can say get some nice highlights on these areas of the dials and the buttons, and also they might catch some highlights on the edges of this glass and of this bezel. So I'm going to make soft round lights, these are very handy, and scale it down to be just 5 by 5 in size. I'm going to make it brightness 1000, and to do this more detailed lighting I'm going to import the model into Light Studio. So I'll press play, that will import that model. Okay, and then I'm going to zoom in to the edge on here of this dial, of this button actually, Okay, and then I'm going to use light paint to click on here to move that light. Now that light actually is a bit small. I'm going to solo it, and I'm going to make it larger. 15. So I quite like that it's creating this bit of shadow, which gives this a bit more depth. I think probably I need to pick a highlight up higher up. So let's just turn solo as well, the background gradient there. And then we can pan in this view here to the top. And with this round light selected, let's use the light paint tool to click up there, unsolo the gradient background so we can see. Now that's exactly what I wanted. We've got this nice highlight we've caught highlight on here, we're pinging on the knurling on this dial here, and we're creating some depth. So I'm very pleased with that. So let's turn on the rest of the lights by unsoloing that little highlight light. I'll be interested to see if I could pick something up around here in terms of a highlight. So I'm going to duplicate that light and fit my render view here, and then I'm going to zoom into this area and solo the gradient and this new light, and use light paint and just see if I can pick up another edge over here. And then I'm going to turn off the gradient to just solo that. And again, I'm quite pleased with that edge that I've just picked up with that light. So that looks nice to me. So I'll unsolo that. Now at this stage, the lighting's all getting a bit blown out. So these last two lights, I should have been really naming them as I went along, but the last two, I'm going to reduce their brightness. So they'll still create the nice highlight and the reflections, but we don't want that watch face to be quite as blown out. And then I'm going to take down this background gradient a small amount. Okay, that's looking good. Now, for me, the strap doesn't quite have enough form to it. So I'm going to pause our renderer. We don't really need that at the moment. And on this strap, I'm going to do a soft round light and click up here. And then we're just going to do a bit of a boost. We're going to do turn that down so I can see this bright area. So let's say 15 by 15. We're just picking out a little bit of a boost to pick up some highlights. I'm just going to try and pick a nice position for that. And then duplicate that light. And I'm going to do the same down here, but not quite as bright, so I'm going to just dial that back. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I'd like to get a bit of interest in the front here on the face. So I'm going to go to my presets, and I might use a window because there's a bit of interest in the reflection if I do that. So I'm going to drop the light roughly in place here. I'll scale it down, dragging that down to be a bit smaller. Increase the brightness. And click on the face here. And we'll solo it. Kind of just see the kind of effect that we get. And I kind of there's a little bit of colour in it, but I'll reduce the saturation to about half. And then we'll unsolo so we can see the whole lighting design. So you kind of get a bit of interest in the face there. It's not particularly studio lighting-y, but I do like kind of subtle, kind of more photoreal details in the lighting if you can get them. Just turn the brightness of it down a little bit. I just think it adds a little bit of interest. So one thing that's a bit disturbing to me is on this edge here is where you can see how this wraps all the way around. You've got this kind of black line kind of moving around there. I'd quite like to get rid of that. So let's get one of these. I'll double click and add that to the lighting design, and then we'll click on here to position that. So that needs to go around there, and then we'll scale that up. Or maybe make it wider. And as you can see there, look, that's reduced that effect there. I'll just make that a little bit brighter. Maybe a little bit wider. And we'll solo it just to see its effect on the shot there. Now really what I don't want is this part of the lighting being affected, because that was a really nice part of the original lighting. So I'll solo this. I'll make it more skinny and move it until it doesn't affect. Okay, so that's kind of almost catching a highlight down the edge. I'll turn that back off there. So it's killed some of it. I think it beds that edge. If I turn it off, it's a bit harsher. So you could kind of see that going up and around. And if I put that on, that kills that a little bit. So that's, yeah, I think I'm happy with that. So let's finalize the lighting. So I'll press the HDR button and let's call that, yeah, that's already set to be called lighting final. The resolution 5K. So we'll render this final lighting design. Fantastic. So this is the time to stop HDR Light Studio. And we can close the connection panel. This is also the time to save the Cinema 4D project, so that the embedded lighting design project made by Light Studio is stored with this scene. And then let's go and turn off interactive rendering and render the production render for this image. Okay, so here's the final result. Final lighting. As you can see, the geometry, you can see the polygonization of the geometry because we're so close. But that's basically the approach for this kind of front-on lighting of this shot. And if I compare this to the kind of lighting we were going for, I think it's been pretty successful. So that's it. That's our lighting tutorial of doing the front view of this watch in Cinema 4D with Corona Renderer and HDR Light Studio. Thank you for watching.